So, welcome everyone back to another round of debates at Arthuria. This time we are going to be doing a moderated debate on the proposition consensus-based legal systems are not the best for reducing exploitation. CoolDog is taking the affirmative, as in he will begin by arguing that it is not the best for reducing exploitation. Marximillian will be taking the negation there. He will be opposed. With that being said, both of our participants have agreed to special moderation rules today, which are going to begin with 5-minute opening statements for each of them, which will be timed. And then following that, they will have 2 minutes each to cover their side of a response back and forth, where the other is not to be talking or interrupting. When our participants run out of time, I will begin talking over them incessantly, just like you see on CNN or any other platform where there's a presidential debate. That way they get the idea to quiet down, and then I can start the timer. If one of them interrupts, I'm going to stop the timer for their opposition, and they're going to continue. This debate's going to run for approximately an hour and a half, and we'll end with some closing statements. With that being said, I do believe Marximillian is starting with opening statements. So, Marx, whenever you're ready, feel free to take it away.
So let's say just thanks for everyone for joining and listening. Thanks to Walt for moderating. I'm glad I don't have your job. I'm going to try and do this quick opening that I wrote up within 5 minutes, which I'm hoping is just going to take time to review the proposal at hand, so everyone has an idea of what the hell it is we're talking about. So the first question we have to ask is, what is meant by a consensus-based legal system? And what do we mean by reducing exploitation? For the purpose of this debate, a consensus-based legal system is one which operates on the agreement to, but not necessarily the approval of, a given legislative policy by its legislative parties. Consensus is a process which is adopted, not a structure. The process of consensus operates in its most basic form in the following manner. Step 1, a measure is proposed and recognized. Step 2, legislative parties debate the proposal as it stands. Step 3, legislative parties are given an opportunity to register objection to passage. Step 4, if an objection is sustained, legislative parties modify the proposal in accordance with the concerns raised. Step number 5, the modified proposal re-enters into step 1, and the process repeats until there are no more sustained objections or until the measure is tabled. As with any modern legislative process, the process itself is subject to modification and refinement. For example, the process could be modified such that for an objection to be sustained, a modification which would resolve the objection must be suggested by the objecting party. This would establish a requirement for modified proposals and prevent objection without cause. Separate but related to this is the form and structure of that legislative institution. It is possible to establish consensus-based legal systems within a framework of democratically elected representatives, wherein all representatives engage in the process of consensus on behalf of their constituents. In my particular view, the most appropriate structure for legislative institutions is a system of delegation through direct workers' councils. I fully anticipate that my opponent is going to conflate the two and attempt to project what they perceive as flaws in consensus among a broad and diverse population of working people with flaws in consensus itself. While I will address these claims, I do not consider them to be pertinent to the proposition. In order to compare adequately the reduction of exploitation derived from a consensus-based legal system to that of any other, we must proceed from equal assumptions. We need not assume rational behavior, assert perfect knowledge, or anything of the sorts. We need only to show that given the same assumptions, a consensus-based legal system affords a greater reduction in exploitation than alternatives. Put more simply, my opponent must demonstrate that a group of elected representatives would necessarily reduce exploitation equally or more so using non-consensus-based legal systems than they would using a consensus-based legal system. Speaking on the matter, exploitation has been defined by my opponent as anything that gives one group an advantage at the expense of another. Putting aside for a moment that this definition would cover potentially any appropriation of finite natural resources for use by any subset of the population as exploitation, we can focus on the central question here, namely the expense of another. Herein, we must recognize that all action and inaction comes at an expense. The critical question is, therefore, not whether or not these are expenses, but whether or not the subject considers expense to outweigh the benefits. Accordingly, to reduce exploitation in this regard is to advance and enable the greatest degree of consent with respect to expenses. Ergo, it seems that the task of my opponent is simple, if not impossible. In order to demonstrate that a consensus-based legal system is not the best for reducing exploitation, they must demonstrate an alternative legal system which provides greater degree of consent, a word which literally shares its root word with consensus. That is all.
All right, and CoolDog, you can go ahead and respond with your opening statement here.
All right, first, a very quick thank you to everybody, especially the audience, for listening to us. My grateful opponent for such a fantastic opening statement, and of course, the job we don't envy, Waltz. So I want to go through first, I want to do 4 contentions as to why I believe that consensus-based systems are not the best for reducing exploitation. And then I want to run some permutations and give some example counter systems which may be possible to reduce exploitation more. So my first contention is it is impossible to reach 100% consensus due to holding of categorical beliefs. So either you will not be able to reach consensus on something like abortion, where somebody thinks it should be categorically banned, or that all people's views will not be represented in the law somehow. You're going to have some people who are holding out on, for example, another example would be banning assault rifles. Some people want to ban it, and even the question of what an assault rifle is and what type of weapon should be banned. Some people think you should be able to own anything. Abortion is a better example, but the holdouts will prevent a law from ever taking effect on these issues. 2, second contention, allows the exploitation of ignorant people is because we're allowing more and more people from disparate industries and who are not necessarily in the jack of all trades things. Their specific knowledge will be exploited by experts. And due to the fact that experts are interested parties when we're making a consensus system, they will want to advantage themselves over others. A great example of this, which we can get into detail, is when we look at certain state pension programs. I'm more familiar with the Kentucky one. There's a great documentary on it by Frontline, where people from various industries there was only one person with an economic knowledge background. They were exploited by so-called experts due to their lack of knowledge. So contention 3 is that if everything is up for consensus, then consensus itself is up for the debate. In doing such, there is no guarantee that the system will persist through time. There is no reason to believe that this will have staying power over other systems. Unlike systems which are not consensus-based, there are certain rules which cannot be contested. And then 4th contention is analysis paralysis. So either every new policy or allocation must go through the lengthy consensus-based process where we supposedly have to unify all of these disparate working council whatevers, right? Which is really just representative democracy, saying representative democracy again, right? So either you will be unable to deal with emergent situations, in which case you can't deal with the here and now exploitation that might arise, or you'll have to delegate emergency powers to somebody else, and in doing so, you will allow them to exploit people because they have the power to do so. And there's no way to sort of check it in the immediate short-term future because you have to go through the lengthy consensus process. So also an ongoing lack of consensus because we have to do all this modification, right, over time. And if we have, if everybody doesn't agree to it, then we can't go forward, right? An ongoing lack of consensus leads to the permissibility of oppression in the meantime, or exploitation in the meantime. So there are 3 important permutations to the consensus-based system which you should be aware of. The first is do everything that my opponent said, except for one thing: consensus is not up for debate. Permutation 2, which would also be better, is you have certain fundamental rules that are not up for debate. For example, we have to confine murderers, for example, or stealing incurs some form of state action, or like the state's monopoly of violence cannot be revoked. We have to have these rules in place which cannot be modified or changed. And then permutation 3 is the combination of 1 and 2. So then some counter systems that might work is, since we're in crazy hypothetical land and we can do whatever we want, I can, similarly to the way that my opponent fiats into existence a smooth running bureaucracy uniting 300 plus million people and supposedly having everybody have a say, is if we have an omniscient, omnibenevolent, and someone with the requisite powers to be a monarch, then she can run the place and there will be zero oppression. Right. Another idea is a parliamentary representative democracy system, right, where the government, whenever the government is in deadlock and they can't pass new legislation, then we have a new election of representatives, and then we have a robust system in place for people to vote on referendums that get a certain number of signatures. Another idea that I was just throwing around is a localized Luddite tribal societies. There will be less exploitation because everybody has to work as a group for survival. Their survival is they're codependent on a much more localized scale. And there are some potential counter argumentations here, but those are like 3 possible systems, which we can talk about more about. But then recapping, impossible to reach 100% consensus due to categorical beliefs, allows for the exploitation of ignorant people. Consensus itself is up for debate. 4, the analysis paralysis problems, the 3 permutations, and then the counter systems. And that's my case.
Excellent, right on time. So we'll go ahead and get started now with the back and forth. The back and forth section, for those of you who missed it, will be 2-minute statements, beginning now with Marximillian in response, and then going over to CoolDog at any point. If they want to waive time or stop early, they can. And then we will just continue to have these statements until we run out of time and it's time for closing. So with that being said, Marx, you can go ahead and initiate the back and forth.
Yeah, so I think essentially every point that was raised is either not really applicable to the proposition at hand, or is something that we would see that is at least available or as an option in other systems. For example, the idea that it's impossible to reach 100% consensus, well, clearly that is not the case in any existing system where consensus is not even attempted. So if that is an argument against why consensus is going to succeed, then it seems a little bit weird to me that we're essentially imposing that as a requirement on the system when it is not a requirement on the current system. That being said, I would say that consensus models do not necessarily require unanimity. You know what I'm trying to say. They don't require 100% consensus necessarily. You can, again, refine the process itself. So you can allow for certain objections to be blocking, and you can allow to limit blocks as one example. So, for example, each legislative participant might only get 2 blocks per session in which they can attempt to block legislation. So then they're required to use these. That said, the process of consensus itself still stands. This does not default to representative democracy in the sense that it is no longer a competitive operation, but is still a consensus-based model where concerns first have to be heard and issues with those concerns have to be addressed, and or modification of proposals is attempted. Number 2, on the question of if it allows exploitive interest by expert systems, that clearly happens in the current system. Experts exploit their expertise in order to persuade individuals one way or another. The major distinction with consensus here is that other parties that are experts on the issue but have alternative opposition will have their concerns more easily heard and more easily addressed, and will have the potential to potentially block dire situations where the rule of a majority simply overcomes the rule of a minority. Consensus itself being up for debate.
We are out of time.
Yeah.
All right, CoolDog, your response, please.
Okay, so going off this about the impossible to reach 100% consensus, and you say that it's not possible, that we don't have that in our current system. Well, yeah, but we're still passing laws, right? And so it seems like, especially with your response to the experts exploit, here we have like kind of like the tension with the consensus-based system. On one hand, it's supposed to be this great thing where everybody can come in and everybody can make an argument and make an amendment, right? But on the real other hand, it doesn't have to be 100% consensus. It's basically majority rule yet again. And so it seems like the consensus-based system collapses into a representative democratic system, especially considering that if you look at our current system, we're making amendments to bills too. And there's a lot of backroom talks that go on with the representatives. So it's unclear how this is substantially different than the current system that we have. And if both are equal, I win, because it's not the best, because there's another system there that is equally as good. So, or potentially even better, because we don't run into the problems that were left unaddressed. And I want to carry is the fact that these long processes are themselves up for debate. And so when you have that happening, when you do not have a stable framework, as I said in my third contention, right? And that's why my permutation should still be carried, that we need some fundamental basic rules that are not subject to consensus, so that we do not have a collapse of the system, because when the system doesn't work, everything is going to be thrown to hell with everybody arguing about how to change the system, right? Additionally, about the experts' points, right, is again, experts already can come into play. You can spend money on lobbying and current systems and things like that, and you don't open up a lot of uneducated people to having to make major policy decisions here, right? And so I just think that the omniscient monarch situation, the parliamentary representative democracy system, and the localized Luddite tribal societies have quicker and more efficient ways of solving the problem without having this analysis paralysis where you can't pass anything.
All right, Marx, back to you.
Yeah, so I will remind my opponent of the proposition, which is that the question is whether or not it is the best at reducing exploitation. We are still passing laws in the current system. We're passing heavily exploitative laws in the current system. And what we tend to see from this is an increase in polarization. That is to say that polarization is a byproduct of the existing legal systems, which although have become increasingly democratic, still enable the will of others with sufficient power to completely negate the concerns and will of those of less. By contrast, the consensus-based system allows those concerns to be heard, even if they're not experts on the concerns, which is what prevents experts from taking control over the system, as is described. The idea that consensus itself is up for debate, well, every legal system is up for debate. It just depends on how far people want to go to debate it, right? The idea that our legal system is somehow less exploitative because it coerces people into conforming to it through use of force, as opposed to through a consent-based model of consensus, is a pretty absurd argument in my take. I mean, like, if people are coerced into doing something, then we would argue that the exploitation is higher in that system, not lower. The fact that it's coercive may give it a certain amount of longevity, it may give it a certain amount of efficiency, but that's not what we're arguing for. What we're arguing for is the reduction in exploitation, which the current system does not seem to provide any meaningful way to do this, any meaningful way of self-representing, any meaningful way of representing in a way that allows minority opinions to really interject against the power. I don't want to say minority opinions, but less powerful opinions to interject and make concessions upon the more powerful players.
All right, and CoolDog?
All right, so yeah, on this point, right, is that this is the slipping, right? Because let's talk about the tyranny of the majority, which is present in both systems that you're arguing for, right? Is, okay, we let the concerns be held, and AOC and the current representative democracy can say whatever the hell she wants and try to pass whatever bill she wants, but she's not going to pass it. And so in your consensus-based system, you're magicking away this problem by saying, yeah, we hear every concern, but the majority is still the one that makes the decisions, because we don't need 100% consensus, because that reaches us to a deadlock, which is, again, the point that my opponent is failing to really recognize, is the fact that efficiency is a very, very, very important piece of the puzzle here. Because if you have an inefficient system, this is going back to the emergent oppressions point and the analysis paralysis point, is like, if there's an emergent situation that is causing an exploitation, or someone finds a loophole in the system and starts exploiting people, if you can't come to a ready solution quickly, then that's going to cause more exploitation than other types of systems, as I talked about, where you can more quickly reach a policy alternative. It's not like by magic, okay, the consensus thing is going to pass the laws. No, we got to talk practically about how this is going to actually work. And the holdouts of the group will not be represented in their categorically oppositional views to things like abortion and so forth. Furthermore, my opponent is conveniently not addressing the permutations to the consensus-based system, which will effectively rescue part of the good parts of it by making some things not up for debate. And if we have a system where anybody at any time can basically modify a proposal to completely refigure the government, you'll be trapped in a constant debate about what this system is even supposed to look like at every single turn. And so I think you're opening up such a huge can of worms, and you can never get to actually passing laws to end exploitation in the status quo.
All right, Marx.
Yeah, so again, these problems are not overcome by a democratic system. The benefit that my opponent has is that we do have a current legislative system which is, for lack of better terms, quite old, right? So we've had a lot of time to refine these positions and work through these problems. If you'll remember, the United States went through this thing called the Civil War, right, where an entire part of the nation wanted to secede based on the idea basically that they wanted a different way of organizing their power structure, organizing their political structure, and different laws, specifically around questions of slavery and obviously states' rights in general. So that being said, like, I think we're getting a little bit far off the course here when we talk about this idea that a consensus-based system is somehow subject to these problems more than any other system. I will repeat again that the system itself would undergo refinement. The idea that you cannot have laws which allow for executive authority, for example, is a little bit strange to me. The structure of the system is not really relevant here. It doesn't mean that every single decision has to be voted on, right? We can have a legislative system that is built by consensus that decides to give executive authority to another institution or another body. We could still have separation of powers. We could still have states' rights versus federal government. We could still have all these different levels of legislative authority in which these different decisions are made. So the idea that everyone has to be united across the nation, well, that's clearly not the case even in our Republican democracy, and that's dependent on the structure rather than the form or the process that the legal process takes, or that the legal institutions takes. So I think it's like a little bit disingenuous to pin these problems on a consensus-based model when all these problems essentially exist in a Republican democracy model, and we've essentially already worked through them. Well, that's great, but what prevents us from working through them in a consensus-based model?
All right, CoolDog.
All right. Again, I think that that the audience should pay attention to the sleight of hand that's going on here in this response. Right, is the fact that we're basically rebranding representative democracy and magically calling it a consensus-based system. Right. And so if we're doing all of these things, which are essentially creating a representative democratic system, hell, again, I brought this point up previously. In our current system, we have it in place where people raise amendments, where the representative raise amendments. We have all of these things that seem to be basically a consensus-based system within the legislative body. And so again, my opponent disagrees, presumably, with how he talked about our current system. He thinks it is not the best for dealing with exploitation. And so if the two are equal, I obviously win. And I think that you have to have some degree of separation here. But, additionally, beyond that, we're yet to still talk about the permutations or the alternatives that I've raised, right? Because there seems to be at least an inkling of doubt about this magic consensus system, which will not run into some serious problems, as you say, like our current own, when I've presented ones that will clearly, the permutations, which stop all the rigmarole about should we abandon consensus or not. There needs to be some fundamental things that we agree with in order to continue, right? And so those permutations, which had an element of non-consensus to them, is what saves, as well as the other, which you've yet to address at all. And I carry these through, and I should be winning on these because we never mentioned them. So the audience has to presume is, we have the enlightened monarch, we have the parliamentary representative democracy system with new elections when we're deadlocked, with robust systems for voting reforms, and we have the localized Luddite tribal society where people are forced to bond together and can't exploit other people due to survival reasons, right? And so in presence of these permutations and these counter plans, I think
we're out of time. All right, Marx, back to you.
Yeah, so I think we need to be cautious that whenever my opponent mentions magic, he's doing this purely as a rhetorical device, right? He's trying to put magic in front of it, so this sounds like some fanciful idea. As my opponent has already mentioned, there are some sort of hints at concession that occur within the existing system. However, if we take the existing system as an example, one of the key differences is basically that legislation in non-consensus-based systems, particularly representative democracy, or for that matter, the enlightened monarch, is necessarily exploited as concessions need only go so far as to meet the subjective desires of a plurality of those with legislative power. A consensus-based system by opposition, even if it doesn't work on unanimity, God damn it, you know what I mean? But even if it doesn't need 100% agreement, does allow for alternatives to arise, in which case either an extreme supermajority, so for example, again, in limiting the amount of blocks that can be performed, maybe you need 97% agreement or something there, right? Because because blocks are so limited that people can't get through. Now, you say this is a repetition of representative democracy, and I disagree completely, because unlike representative democracy, we don't have these goals in which it's like a 60 to 40% majority, which once hit, we no longer have to listen to the other side. The consensus-based process allows all parties concerned to raise their issues to modify the proposals. Will we have limitations and refinement of that process so that this process doesn't necessarily take forever? Sure. Will we have alternative structures which we empower through that legislative body? Sure. The division between legislative and executive branches is not at the concern here. In fact, that's something that I think we should uphold. So a legislation giving executive authority is not a problem for a consensus-based legislative system, and therefore we don't run into this problem of expediency or issues that need to be done. The legislative process obviously still constrains that authority, as it does in Republican democracy. However, the consensus process still operates, allowing all individuals to express problems and seek modification and concessions in that process.
We are out of time. All right. CoolDog.
Great. I mean, I think that we're getting into the meat of debate here, and I think the audience will clearly see here that if we go to 97% consensus here, where you need a majority of 97%, then you're never going to be able to pass a law on abortion. You're never going to be able to pass a law legalizing marijuana. You're never going to be able to pass a law with what to do with a serial killer, because more than 3% of the population wants those people to fry. And so when there's large groups of people in any country or that hold these categorical belief systems, right? That hold these categorical belief systems. So either you have to back up the threshold of majority far enough so that you can knock out the categorically opposition people, or and if you do that, you essentially reach a point where we're at a goalpost that is being set and we collapse to representative democracy, or you make it so strict that it makes it impossible for these laws to happen. Now, again, my opponent in his opening statement mentioned that exploitation has a lot to do with our utilitarian calculus. And so when he says these things like the enlightened monarch only allows for those with executive power to raise concerns, is absurd, because the omniscient monarch will be able to know exactly what those concerns are from the get-go. Right. And so this hypothetical runs and would clearly reduce exploitation less. And again, we can run the representative democracy thing, as well as like in a more tribalized society where survival is the number one priority and it's very difficult, where you have to be mutually aligned with each other. Then that's obviously a less exploitative system, because there's no at the expense of others. It's the group as a whole. And the magic here is hoping that throwing a bunch of people in a room will make them be able to agree on everything. And I think that's impossible.
All right, Marx.
So there's no hoping here. But notice that every time my opponent invokes magic on my behalf, he needs to assume a magical system with an omniscient and all-knowing monarch in order to compete it. Right? What we're talking about is a system that allows for differences to arise and allows for those concessions to be written into law. So, for example, my opponent talks about categorical differences, but he doesn't seem to address why these laws can't take into account these categorical differences and write those laws so that they apply distinctly for cultural or regional differences or whatever it happens to be. Again, the same way that we have federal law and the same way that we have state law that sometimes contradicts federal law, but at least works within federal law. So we have this idea that we can have a general consensus at a higher level and we can have a lower consensus at another level to have explicit differences between these regional changes or regional differences between people. Nothing prevents that in a consensus-based system. The only difference we're talking about is the say and the authority and the concessions that people have to exercise their power within that system. And in any legislation that is non-consensus based, this is a necessarily exploitative system. You could see it in the language that my opponent uses when he talks about the idea that we still need a supermajority to push their will on other people. And it's the complete opposite in a concession-based system, right? Because we're not aiming for the majority. The aim is to modify the proposal to take into consideration the concerns of all those parties. For expedience sake, do we eventually have to vote on laws? Yes. And the limitations and the terms on that and when we have to be expedient and how quickly we have to go through this process are all things that can be decided by the very same system.
All right, CoolDog.
And here, my dear audience, we have reached the contradiction. So we are supposed to be able to put in law that abortion should never be done under any situation, which a large portion of the population believes. And on the other hand, it will also be in the law that you have a right to have access to abortions. A blunt contradiction that the consensus-based system cannot reconcile, which leads to the analysis paralysis that having a system in which laws can actually pass is much better, because if you can't pass any of these laws on fundamental issues like this, then that's the breeding ground for exploitation, because you don't have a sufficiently responsive enough system to deal with the problems of the day. Right. And notice how, again, whenever countering this point, my opponent either backs up the goalpost to basically make it a representative democracy where sides will certainly form in order to get to the majoritarian threshold, or or you're stuck in the analysis paralysis land, and it's essentially the refutation to my argument is to do representative democracy. Now, of course, I appeal to you, thinking that you can get 97% of people to agree on an abortion law is just as absurd as the enlightened monarch. Additionally, we have not talked about a more localized system where we don't have potentially a sort of anarchist system where people need to band together in very small groups with more limited technology in order to survive. I think this is no more of a fanciful reality than hoping that we can deal with all of our fundamental issues in a way that is robustly different than what we have now. My opponent has not given you enough of the imaginative work to see how you can get a 97% consensus at all. So.
All right, Marx.
So my opponent is still appealing to this idea that the 97% have to agree on a particular issue. For example, whether or not abortion is illegal or illegal or legal or illegal categorically, right? This is not the case, and that's the entire point. He keeps pushing down the idea of what we do in competitive-based legal systems, right? The idea that we have to coerce one group to conform to the standards of the other. And again, this is the complete opposite of a consensus view, right? The consensus view does not say that one of these parties has to win. Rather, what it says is that all of these parties have to come to an agreement which all of them can live with, which may include the potential that abortion is legal in some cases, abortion is illegal in other cases, and some of those cases may simply be regionally defined, right? The same way that we have states' rights, the same way that we have state law that can supersede on certain issues that aren't directly contradicted by federal law, the federal law. There's no difference in the structural organization of this. The only difference that we might see is rather than having a law which actually has to be obtained at a regional level, we could actually see laws that are potentially based purely on consent or enrollment into that law, for example, right? Now that would prevent, for example, certain doctors under certain conditions in one of these regions or cultural societies from performing acts on another individual, for example, right? So we can have a divide that is legally based, but not necessarily like a divided nation, right? There's no need for this idea that everyone has to agree 100% when a consent model allows for resources, allows for the actual legislative authority, enforcement of law, and things like that to be divided up within the law itself. To say, hey, if you guys want to allow murder, like, here's a territory for you, and everyone who consents to allowing murder can go to that territory. And everyone who doesn't consent to going to allow murder can go to this territory.
All right. It's going to be time. All right, CoolDog, your response.
So notice, again, what is happening is in order to deal with the contradictions that will arise, we slide immediately back into the system that we currently have, right? And again, there is no way possible for you to get the holdout categorical people on abortion is a great example of this, to be able to live with the fact that abortion will be allowed. And so your solution is to basically do what we're doing now. Have these regional systems where, like, in certain states, there's like only one abortion clinic and people don't have access to it. Right, where you will definitely be seeing one group is advantaged and another group is disadvantaged due to the fact that once we realize that there's a set of people that will not budge and that we can overrule them in order to actually pass a law, that those people will be exploited by the majority yet again. It's the same soup with a different name. And by some unknown, I have no clue how this happens, the 100 senators and however 200 whatever representatives who are all talking together about what bills to pass is somehow not consensus, right? Not a consensus-based system with, in our case, like a 60% majoritarian threshold. I fail to see what the substantial difference is. And it just seems to be either idle musings of hoping that for some reason people can agree on everything and can come to live with these categorical beliefs, or it just slides back into what we currently have. And again, I really do want to talk about why the enlightened monarch doesn't work. Since we're basically setting things in stone with fiat, I don't see why mine is not clearly the best system that we should try to strive towards, as well as how uniquely a consensus-based system is going to be able to deal with emergent problems and prevent an executive tyrant, right? And how it can respond quickly enough to deal with emergent exploitation.
All right, that's time on that response. Marx, go ahead.
So I'm going to go into more of a question format because I'm really not understanding what my opponent's not getting about this. So the idea that you say people can't live with a fact. So if people can't live with a fact in the current coercive system, what is it that they do? The current competitive, legal, coercive system where in minor bills, a 51% majority can overturn a 50% majority, and in the best of bills, a supermajority of roughly 60 is able to overturn 40%. What happens when someone can't live without a ruling in this society?
Sorry, what restate the question?
The question, you said people can't, what happens when people can't live with a certain, like, the consensus won't happen because people who oppose abortion can't live with the idea that abortion is occurring anywhere in the world. Is that a correct statement? Is that a correct understanding?
The 40% have to live with it, where in your system they endlessly debate it.
So the 40%, the 60% are advantaged to the expense of the 40%. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay, so that's exploitation, right?
Yes, but in your system, the 3% exploits the 97% by holding out. And if you back up that threshold, we're back into a competitive legal system.
So why do we have to back up the threshold if we can have a system where the number of blocks that you can perform per session, for example, is limited?
But then this is again just the tyranny of the majority in a different way, right? Because the majority of people will just keep proposing the exact same bill, and then you block, and then the minority party of 40%, 30% of people who believe abortion should be categorically illegal use up all of their blocks, and then they can't block on real policy differences that are more important as well.
Yeah, so that's a decision that they made, right?
Right.
So they chose their own consent on a cost analysis, right? Cost benefit analysis.
Yeah, but that leads to a situation where the people who they're like, they agree on, they have good alternatives to bring up. They use all of their blocks because of their categorical reasoning, and you get to a point where exploitation is easily available because people don't really have a right to raise whatever issue they want, and they can't be represented in the law because it's just tyranny of majority all over again, just as we have now.
All right, so just really quickly, because we are deviating from format, excuse me, just really quickly, because we are deviating from format, let's go ahead and do this. Would we be good with setting aside approximately 20 minutes or so here to just kind of a back and forth with Q&A, and then what we can do is take maybe the last 10 minutes before closing statements, any questions from the audience? Would that work for both of you?
I'm down.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to set a...
Just Walt, make sure that I don't talk too much.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll stop you guys if I hear someone going on for more than a minute or so. You'll see me unmute, and that'll be your first hint. And if it keeps going after that, I'll go ahead and butt in and say, let's have a chance for a response. But yeah, with that being said, I'll go ahead and set that timer 20 minutes, and we'll just kind of have a back and forth questions between both of you.
Sure.
So, like, I can briefly restate the point that I was making, right? is like if we do have a limited block system, right, then this prohibits people who do have strongly held categorical views from participating in the system after they use their stuff. So their views are really not raised, and it becomes a situation where after you exhaust that blocks, right, then the majority party or the majority contingent, right, then they get to set the law, right?
So two things. I mean, this is not there is no majority in terms of like an overall majority. This is not a parliamentary system where you have two opposing parties, right? Now, obviously, you may have majorities that agree, but your majority is going to differ every time, right? Do you understand that?
Yes and no, right? Because it depends where are you setting your threshold.
Okay, so is it up to someone to prioritize what they use their blocking for?
Correct.
So someone can make a cost-benefit analysis of issues that they really care about, in which they are really concerned with the outcomes, and therefore limit their expense the most, correct?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so in a system where there's like a simple representative democracy, and basically all you have to do is get over a threshold of convincing enough people, and then you can completely disregard the concerns of the others, how is that a system which leads to less concern over the expenses that these people will have to pay?
Right. It's because they always have the ability to raise an issue, even in the minority contingent. They can still try to persuade others to get to their position, and they can still vote as a block with people and play spoiler, right, to have their issues heard. But in your system, once you've done what you did, once you take a stand on an issue, you're just along for the ride at that point, and your voice doesn't matter.
Wait, how is that the case though? If rolled into the process is the system of objection and modification of the proposal?
Right, because you're preventing those people from continually modifying the proposal.
No, you're preventing them from blocking.
Blocking? What do you mean by that?
So I think you're confusing two different things, right? In a consensus-based system, you can raise an objection or a concern, and you can raise a modification to the proposal. Right. That is not the same as blocking the proposal.
Okay. So if one person blocks a proposal, we don't get anywhere?
Yeah, if one person blocks a proposal, that proposal would be tabled. And if they only have one block per session, then they can only ever block one proposal. And that doesn't mean they can't raise concerns in another proposal.
Now, presumably in this system, right, let's say we have a bill about gun rights, for example, that comes up. If that's blocked, are people allowed to bring up an essentially identical proposal after that?
I would say that would be dependent on the rules of the system itself, right? So the idea that you could bring up a proposal that is the exact same as another proposal, or for that matter, that if you block, so you could create a rule that says, hey, if you're going to block, you need to create a modification to this proposal that would allow you to take your block off. So you can't just block and say, I'm just blocking because fuck you, right? Like you have to produce a modification to the proposal that you would accept, right?
Right. Okay. But like, again, this is like the analysis paralysis point, and you can't get there because like, let's say we do this, right? Then the anti-abortion person, every time that we bring up a bill on abortion, is going to say, I block. My modification is abortion should be illegal in all situations. That is the proposal that I would lift my block over.
Sure, but you could also have a rule that says the modification cannot be an explicit negation of the original proposal.
Right. And so then what happens if someone has a proposal which says murderers should be allowed to walk free? It can't be an explicit negation of the proposal.
Right. So someone might have to say, well, murderers shouldn't be allowed to walk free. However, murderers should get XXXYZ rights, right?
Okay. So in the same coin, now the anti-abortionist comes up and says there will be one abortion clinic in the entire United States and only one person will be allowed to be seen every day.
Yeah, so I don't think so. I mean, to me, this is a little bit weird, right? Is you're proposing legislation that is essentially like the dictates of very specific things and very specific ideas of like what exactly is to happen in society, and that's not legislation, right? That's not what legislative bodies do. Legislative bodies create generalized rules which apply to systems, right?
But they also create specific prohibitions.
I would argue that that is more of an executive position. Specific prohibitions.
It's in the bills. What are you talking about?
Yeah, so there are specific prohibitions on certain acts, but there are not things like there will be one abortion clinic in society. And even if that is the case, you still seem to be disregarding the idea that a consensus-based proposal allows for different factions within that group to then create a policy which adheres different regional differences, right? So you could say there's going to be one abortion clinic in this region, and then for all those that agree, and we're going to divide the region proportionally to say, hey, basically in this other region of the country, right, abortion clinics are basically going to be able to create ad hoc as they do in the current society, and in this one region, you guys are going to have one, and all those who agree with the one are then free to have that society.
Right, but how is this like different than our current system where we do have these different state laws? It seems like we reach the same point where the minority always gets screwed and their voice is never really heard, right? Because their categorical view is never put into law.
Wait, so are you saying that the current system is exploitative?
I mean, it's just as exploitative as your system because we're reaching the same point here.
But so the minority in our current system has no way to make any concessions on law.
Right. And in your system, they don't really either.
Well, sure they do. They have an entire process in which they can raise those concerns and propose modifications to the proposal.
But the senators meet with each other and raise concerns and make amendments and modifications to the proposal when they talk with their friends too.
Yeah, but they only do that up until the point where they have enough power to take over the to take over the minority. That's the point.
Right, and you guys do that up until the point of a certain threshold, which is much higher, right? Or you just basically say, nah, yeah, you guys are too obstinate, fuck you guys, essentially.
I'm not sure what the last part refers to.
Limiting their ability to block legislation, limiting their ability to make amendments to the legislation.
So again, like limiting ability to block legislation, this is something that itself would come through the consensus process, the same way that there are rules in the Senate, right? The filibuster rule is something we hear a lot about, right? So all senators at some point agreed to the filibuster rules, right?
Right.
Sorry, not even all senators, a majority of senators. Right. So again, we had a situation where the advantage of the majority came at the expense of the minority, and the minority didn't really have any say, because as soon as the majority found the majority, they stopped listening to the minority altogether. And a consensus-based process negates that by allowing the minority to have an opportunity to express concerns, to express modification of the proposal, even if they don't have a block.
Right. So, like, again, the problem is in your system is you need to somehow eventually weed out the people who are against any proposal that isn't their own. And we've been using the abortion example, right? So you either reach a point where you have to say, look, at a certain point, we have to pass a law on something. And so then your view no longer is up for debate and it's tabled. We go on and we do the whatever regional differences, right? And so eventually you basically kick them to the curb, which is what's happening in our system.
No, but it's not that it's not up for debate. That's where you continue to have the confusion. It means that they can't they can't hold up the legislation. There's a difference.
Right. And so the majority of people who are upholding the legislation over the minority is the exact same thing that's happening now. And being able to raise concerns that will never be acted upon in the law is the exact same system that the minority faces in our system.
The concerns have to be represented in the law through the modifications.
So how is the categorically anti-abortionist person represented in the law?
So we had this discussion offline, and the person who's categorically opposed to abortion is represented in the law by the amount of power that they have to limit or make concessions on those who are pro-abortion, right? Now, your argument is essentially that that their categorical opinion is not represented. And my point is that whatever level of power that they have is represented insofar as they can wield that power in order to get concessions. It may not match their categorical position. However, it is still representative of their categorical position.
Right, but this is the same thing that we have, is like the actual bills that get to legislation are a representation of whatever concessions the groups, the various views can get to.
No, because concessions don't have to be made to minorities.
But they do to a certain extent in order to get Joe Manchin to vote for your bill, right? Is that there is still concessions that are made by the senators talking to each other, and that's a representation of whatever power and influence those people could exert to make the bill what it is. It's the same thing. I can see the same thing.
Sure, but their power and influence is not proportional to their actual representation, right? So if there's a group in Congress right now that consists of 20% of people who want a certain concession, that 20% is completely ignored.
Right, and the 30 or 20% of the categorical abortion people, their view is also completely ignored.
Right, and I'm saying it would not be in a consensus-based system because those people would have the opportunity to raise concerns and have modifications made to the proposal.
Right, in the same way that AOC or whoever, some crazy libertarian, can put on the floor an amendment to a bill, but nothing ends up actually happening from it, just like in your consensus-based system. Just because people have to hear
an amendment to
changes.
Yeah, but so the problem is an amendment to a bill has to undergo a separate vote that is still majority versus non-majority.
Right, and yours basically has to get either it has to get 100% consensus or something close to that or whatever. Right, yours is just a higher.
That's on the final form of the bill. That's on the final form of the bill. Every single cycle which the bill enters has a period of discussion, concerns raised, objections raised, and modification.
Right, and that's exactly what happens in our current system, except your threshold is 100% agreement on the final product.
The modifications are not accepted in the current system. They are subject to majority-minority overrule.
Right, and that's exactly what happens in your consensus-based system because people have to agree which modifications they want.
No.
So there's still a vote on it at some point.
No, you're misunderstanding. They don't have to agree to which modifications they want. The modifications are submitted. Then they have to agree on the bill as modified.
Agree on the bill as modified. So every representative goes through a round where they submit a modification to the bill, right?
So they have a proportional representation in order with which they can represent their concerns in that system.
No. So what Schoolhouse Rock learns whatever, right? So we have a bill that someone proposes, right? And then we do our discussion phase, right? And then in turn, I assume, or everybody at once proposes a modified version of the bill. And then what happens? And
then the modified version of the bill is debated again, and more modifications are submitted. Or if concession is reached, the bill moves forward, the bill is passed, right? If concession is not reached, then you go through another round of modifications. You can limit the number of round of modifications if you're concerned with expediency.
Right. But how do we get to the end of it?
When people agree.
So when everybody agrees.
So again, we can either limit the number of blocks that are allowed. We can require non-unanimous decision making, which I know you say is just another supermajority, whatever. But I think the process itself leads to different outcomes. Or yes, you can say that we're going to have unanimous decisions, and if something is not unanimously passed, then we're not going to accept it.
Right, and I just think that, and I hope the audience realizes that this is like an incredibly difficult system to get everything done because the bar is so high, and I don't think that people are smart enough or willing enough or even able to and that's why I keep using the word magic, right? Is yes, I just do not think that people are psychologically, if you get a group of 100 people, it's going to be impossible, in my view, due to their human nature to agree on the final, all of them to agree on the final product.
So this is not magic. There are historical examples of fairly large-based, consensus-based organizations, including 5 Iroquois nations, which essentially rose to dominance in the region when there was battles between French and British colonial forces. The Iroquois nation used a consensus-based model among the 5 major nations within the Iroquois, the Iroquois Confederacy, as it was called. So that's one example of where consensus actually created not only a sustained, but also a far more advantageous system to others. But I don't want to go into too many of the empirical examples because I want to stay focused on the issue of the question of reducing exploitation. So this is not a debate based on expediency. This is not a debate based on speed. Those may be all concerns with which we need to address within that consensus-based system. And I think I have presented ways in which they can be addressed. The distinction is whether or not it reduces exploitation. And what I am saying is a consensus-based system provides for the greatest amount of consent and agreement. Now, whether that means things that are highly contentious and therefore come at highly exploitative cost, where the advantage of one is so well raised above the expense of the other, I would say that any system which makes it unable for those things to occur is clearly reducing exploitation.
Right. It's not about just simply reducing exploitation, but it's the superlative of that. And may we remind, I'm sure the audience knows this, right? But if you're never able to pass a bill and you can never wield some type of state authority, right, then that's a might makes right anarchy, right? Where exploitation goes through the fucking roof. So it's not like you can just say, okay, efficiency is not the same word as exploitation. They must be completely disconnected, right? The two go hand in hand. If you have a terribly inefficient government that can't be responsive enough to the current times, right, then that's where you get loophole people and you don't have the ability to sufficiently deal with exploitation, right?
So would you agree that people enter? Would you agree that people enter into legal systems? That is, that people accept legal systems on the basis of a certain level of efficiency in this regard?
Well, like I didn't accept the U.S. legal system when I was born.
Sure, but do you follow U.S. laws?
Yeah, I follow them through threat of fear and through like threat of fear of violence. And
so would you consider those laws exploitative?
No, I think some of the laws are quite good, actually.
Well, sure, some of them, but obviously there's a certain amount that advantages others at your expense, correct?
Yeah, but that has to like materially disadvantage, not in some theoretical, oh, I didn't technically consent to it, so therefore I'm somehow exploited. It's got to.
What do you mean materially disadvantage?
Yeah, like it has to actually affect me and not just be a theoretical, oh, I didn't technically consent to it, therefore I'm exploited. Like, that's not what I'm talking about.
Well,
like,
sure, it has to limit your subjective desires, right?
No, again, the definition of exploitation is advantaging one group at the expense of another group. It's not about limiting my desires.
So, okay, then what does that mean? Because I would say that if you, for example, if you make murder illegal, that you advantage people who want to live at the expense of people who want to murder.
Right. So that's a form of exploitation that is lesser than the other way around.
How so?
Because there's less expense being... It's the utilitarian point that you brought up in the first speech.
So are you simply arguing that there's less people that want to murder than there are that want to live?
Yeah.
Okay, so what would prevent...
The disadvantage... The disadvantagement of not being able to fulfill your desire for murder is way less of a disadvantage than the disadvantage it would be to someone who is killed, right?
So I'm not sure how you came to that conclusion.
The expense is less. Obviously, the pleasure of murder is not higher than life itself, which makes that possible.
On what basis do you say that?
No, again, the pleasure of murdering cannot be higher than life itself because life is what makes murdering possible.
Isn't that by definition true that the pleasure of murdering has to be more beneficial than life itself? Like, why else would someone murder someone?
No, it would be more exploitative, and more people would be taken advantage of if we let the murderers murder whoever they wanted. If we let the serial killers kill as many tens of thousands of people.
So the argument is that in a consensus-based system, you don't necessarily have to have either, right? In a consensus-based system, you can come to a consensus that says, look, we recognize in this population there are this many people that don't want to be murdered, that want to protect life, right? And then there's some other percentage of the population that really wants to engage in murder. So we can easily say that there are two regions that we establish in the society, and in this region, murder is legal, and those people who want to consent to murder can go to that region, and those people who don't want to consent to murder can live in the other region. What's the problem?
All right, and CoolDog, go ahead and respond to that question. What is the problem? And then we'll move into Q&A.
I mean, I just like appeal to the audience's sense of absurdity here, because this is like it just seems insane to me, and it's not like you could read people's minds and figure out if they have murderous desires, right? That's not how it works, right? And you know, of course, there are certain. I'm sure we can agree on many like reform systems for criminals, and we could come to a consensus on that between us. But when we're exporting this up to like the top tier, like a higher level where we have to somehow incorporate these views and get me to agree to a weird segregationist system, I mean, like, I'm not even sure I could agree with that. And so, I mean, it seems like any way that you could somehow represent the desires of the murderer or like the anti-abortion people is going to be unacceptable for another group of people.
Okay. With that being said, we'll go ahead and move into Q&A here. So please, if you have questions, please post them in the debate chat, and we'll get to them. And Stone, I'm going to be doing the Q&A, then closing statements, and then the voting poll. We are running a little bit ahead here on time. We wanted to have a minimum duration for about an hour and a half. So with that being said, I've only got 2 Q&A questions right now. I'm going to provide some of my own. For Q&A, I'm thinking about 3 minutes per answer. And we can just kind of go from there, given how few questions we have. So the first question I'm going to have, I'm going to direct to Marximillian. And the question is, isn't this consensus model kind of Kafka-esque? There's a lot of running back and forth to acquire a consensus. There's a lot of bureaucracy and loopholes and games being played here to make a consensus work. Is that an issue for your system, or would that be a misnomer?
I don't see how it's any worse than the current system, and I would argue that in a consensus system, it's better than the current system. I mean, so the issue at hand is essentially which systems do we know of, or which systems currently can we think of that would better or equally reduce exploitation, right? And the concern here, at least as the topic is proposed, again, is not one of expediency. It's not one of questioning bureaucracy. I don't think that bureaucracy would necessarily be higher in a consensus-based system, because I think, again, that any consensus-based system, like any Republican democracy, can refine the system itself through the same process by which it makes decisions at the legislative level, right? So there is an entire rules committee in the Senate, and there's a House committee on rules, and the rules in which our Republican democracy are formulated are probably as vast as the legal system itself. I don't see any problem with a consensus-based system refining itself in order to root out these problems. And I also think those things will be far less contentious. But again, I think the bigger issue here is the question of exploitation, right? We are talking about which system leads to less exploitation or which system reduces exploitation. And I don't see how you get around the fact that a consensus-based system provides for the opportunity for minority parties, no matter how minority they are, to affect a bill. The smaller the minority, the less they're going to be able to affect a bill, right? So that's a given. So their power is only proportional ever to what degree that they have that power. And that's fine. But at the same time, they are given much more of a say than any other system that I know, in which a minority can simply be rejected once the majority is consolidated, right? Now, you could talk about like, hey, this happens behind the scenes or whatever, but there's problems with that happening behind the scenes, as we could see just in terms of like the amount of transparency into our own legislative process. And that only allows for the increase release of this Kafkaesque, as it's put, distortions or whatever you want to call it, right? This system where bureaucrats are entrenched in their role and where bureaucrats are, playing with lobbyists and being influenced by all these like forces that we don't really understand or really can't see, that aren't transparent in the process itself. And I think a system of consensus, not only because the same way that we record legislative hearings, we would record the concerns and the disagreements, which also allows for better accountability long term. A consensus-based model to me, again, just on the question of reduction of exploitation, seems clear. Whether or not you want to argue that it's less expedient, we can have that debate a separate time. But on the question of exploitation, I don't see how you get away from consensus and consent. Again, same root word, being essentially in line with one another, right?
Right. We're just about out of time on that. But I do appreciate that. So CoolDog, I wanted to give you a question as well. And that question is, it seems like democracy is already slow, and that's something that you've agreed to here. Why not do a consensus-based model where we just lock ourselves into a room until we agree and we hammer out these things and we get the best possible policy? Why not just do that?
Because the amount of time that it would take people to agree on that, if it's a sufficiently large group of people to be representative of the population, if you lock them into a room, would take an inordinate amount of time, right? Much longer than in democracy. I mean, look how long some of these papal elections have taken. Look at how long. For example, the Holy Roman Emperor election, where they literally locked people in a room and fed them bread and water until they decided on who would be the leader, right? And you see that in those types of systems, to just agree on one thing, it takes forever, right? And now we're trying to set individual laws and policies about literally everything. The ability to have a way to pass a bill through in the face of dissent, right, is necessary in order to be responsive to the exploitation that will inevitably arise in any system, as well as people who are in the current system trying to exploit people through loopholes, etc. Right? Is you need to be able to be responsive. And so, like when Marximillian says, "Oh, this debate isn't about efficiency," I think it very much is in this important respect, right? And so I don't think that having a perpetually modifying ability to modify will ever get you to be able to pass a law, right? And if you can't pass these laws in a somewhat reasonable manner, right, then it becomes impossible to even start to deal with any exploitation that exists.
All right. Thank you very much. So with that being said, we're going to snap over to a couple questions from the audience, and I'm going to add a minute to the timer for answers here.
It's fine.
So we'll go 4 minutes just so we kind of run these out. First question is going to be just to kind of keep alternating back to Marximillian. Would having a set of inalienable rights or laws make a system no longer a consensus-based system if all other laws are consensus-based?
So I don't see that it would. I mean, obviously, you would be able to argue that the initial set of inalienable rights or laws that were instituted were not derived from consensus. But in the same way that you can argue that, in some ways, like any sort of constitutional monarchy are not necessarily derived from the same form of democracy that we have now, that doesn't really stand to be a problem. That said, I would not ever propose necessarily starting a consensus model from scratch. I would think a consensus model would replace the current model, which means we would basically adopt all existing laws, and that consensus would have to be reached in modification of those laws or removal of those laws or addition of new laws. Therefore, I don't think that questions of this expediency or stuff like that really arise, or at least not as prominently, right? And again, I think there's just a structural decision that has to be made, or a structural organization that has to be taken into account when we say that a legislative body is apparently responsible for making decisions at this like extreme micro level that is just not something that we see with respect to any legislative body. So I mean, like, to me, this just leads to, as much as I'm being called the one who's being absurd, like, we basically have to reduce people who are essentially conceding that they want to organize a society together, right? Because if they didn't, they would just go to war anyway, as nations do. But conceding that they want to organize a society together, yet at the same time somehow just constantly looking for ways to like just troll people and shove it in their face and say like, you said we want yes, I say we want no, and you keep saying yes and I'm going to keep saying no, and we're just going to do this forever and we're all just going to die starving. I heard a song on the radio today which kind of reminded me of this, where the guy sings about going to church and how they always started on time and usually ended on time, but the preacher kept singing, and at the end of it, like, it goes on for long enough that the preacher finally says like, praise to God as all praise should be, but it's time to eat, or something like that. And eventually, like, all people want to get out of the church and go eat because even the preacher gets hungry. And the point is, again, not that we reduce all exploitation, but rather that we reduce it by the highest amount. And therefore, frankly, the longer this process plays out, in my estimation, the better. But insofar as that we realize there needs to be expedited decisions, we can certainly refine that process to limit cases for that.
Right. And I think you do have about a little over a minute left if there's anything else you want to get out there.
No, I would just say carry on.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. And then CoolDog, this next question is for you. Is it not exploitation for the citizenry to be bound to laws they did not agree to? They are forced to abide by standards they do not agree with. In what sense is that not exploitation?
Right. So again, there's like two different ways to respond to this. The first one is, insofar as it is just a, oh man, oh shucks, I didn't agree to this, I'm being taken advantage of. I think to a certain extent the answer from that front would be no, right? In what sense what expense is being taken out of you for the advantage of another with the mere fact that you didn't agree to the law? Right. Now, the other response to this question, which you'll probably sit better with you, is just to say, yeah, in a certain limited sense, sure, right, that there is a level of exploitation here, but we're talking about to get to an absolute minimum of exploitation possible. So like, this is like the function of my fiated enlightened monarch, right? Is it like, sure, there is this minimal sense of exploitation where it's like you don't have like an ability to affect the law, but on the other hand, because he's completely omniscient and has the power to enact it, whatever, right? If he basically makes into existence the best possible world for pragmatic conditions that we're in, right? And so, which is less exploitative, right? Right, it is obviously the one where you don't agree, but you get to take, right? Because everyone there's less overall expense being taken from specific groups or people for the advantagement of other specific groups, right? So then there's a second part of your question, is they are forced to abide by standards they do not agree with. In what sense is this not exploitation? Right, and this is going to be like a problem in Marximillian system as well, because someone like me doesn't want to agree to the consensus-based system get-go, right? So this is like a problem for any type of system where you have a law which you cannot change. Like, maybe direct democracy could maybe solve this, but that would be terrible, right? That is even a bigger efficiency problem, I think. I hope that answered your question. I think I hit the points there.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. And I'm going to just go ahead and start the time again and bounce back to Marximillian. CoolDog, pay attention because you'll have the exact same question to follow. Out of everything reviewed so far and prior to closing statements, are there any areas of agreement that you think you and your opponent, Marximillian, share that are substantive and meaningful outside of just the purposes of debate. Is there anything where you think your worldview and CoolDog's worldview align on the facts of the case here that's meaningful?
Yeah, so I think we agree on the question of expediency. I think we agree on the question of uh, difficulty of this process in a polarized environment. I think we agree on, generally speaking, the notion that like this type of system would perhaps be not the type of system that you would one. I don't think it's the type of system that you would see from like the root of society, right? Like if you created a lawless world, I don't think that you would see this system form. So ever the materialist in that regard. But I would agree that you probably wouldn't want it to be one that's imposed from the start. You would want a society that has gone through a certain level of normalization, so to speak, or at least some sort of development of cultural homogeneity, etc. That all said, so I think there's three major points that we probably agree on there. I think the major disagreement, because obviously I'm going to come back to that just to draw that out, but I think I was charitable on the agreements. The disagreement is that these things are a problem, right? The disagreement is that that these things reflect a negative of the system with respect to exploitation, whereas I think all these things reflect a positive on the system with respect to exploitation. The lack of expediency is precisely the lack of the expediency of one group to coerce another, right? The amount of difficulty that is involved is precisely because it is a system that takes into question the concerns of other people. The reason that you wouldn't want it to start off from the beginning this way is essentially because it is a system that requires a certain development of human thinking, right? Of human understanding, of self-conscious awareness and socially conscious awareness. So I don't think that where we do agree, these things are beneficial to my opponent's argument. Is the shorthand. So we agree on many things. We just disagree that these are winning arguments on his side.
All right, and CoolDog, same exact question. Where do you find meaningful agreement within kind of what's been discussed in this debate
Yeah,
on this with your opponent?
yeah, I think that me and Marximillian, I think on policy level, if we were to talk policy, we would probably agree on a lot of things from what we've touched on. I also think that we share an agreement in that there needs to be our current system is not as good as we could to get, right? I mean, I'm recommending a like for my democratic alternative, right? I'm doing a severely modified. I'm not holding up to a two-party representative like Republican government system, right? So I think that we agree that the current system needs to change. I think we also do both care about having minority views to have some causal influence in the system. I think he thinks it's like very extremely important, right? And I agree. I hold that we both agree on the things that Marximillian said as well. I'm trying to think of other stuff that we agree on. Um, trying to think. We agree. Yeah, I mean, there's something to the idea. I think that we also agree on. There's something to the idea of having some sort of system that allows for people who typically don't have a voice because they're not part of the lawyer ruling class to have a real substantive voice. I think we both agree on that as well, which is a failing of our system, right? And so I think we agree there. And I mean, we also certainly agree on like how polarization makes things difficult, right? How categorical beliefs, cause problems. So I think that's the stuff that we agree on. I think like our disagreements is more around the ability for people to get along and how much the efficiency point matters, as well as there's a question that was brought up to Marximillian that I think is another point of disagreement. Is I think that like if you start having like fundamental rights that can be revoked or can't be modified, right? Then that stops being like a consensus-based system, and so that might be like a slight disagreement down in the weeds there. But I think that those are some good things to agree on.
All right, excellent. So we're coming up here, and it looks like we're actually just about to hit the hour and a half mark with a couple of 5-minute closing statements here. And I believe we wanted to start with Marximillian and end with CoolDog, based on the discussion at the beginning or just prior to the debate. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and set the timer here for 5 minutes. And if either of you at this point goes a little bit over, I'm just going to kind of stopwatch that time, add it to the next person's closing statement so that they get the same amount of time. Try to keep it under 6 minutes for sure if you can. But you guys have actually been just about 50-50 back and forth with either extra leftover time and what have you. So this has been fairly even-handed as far as talk time goes. And thank both of you very much. So Marx, we'll go ahead and start with you with a kind of soft 5-minute, hard 6-minute cutoff here, and go ahead and give us your closing statement.
Yeah, so I think I just want to return to essentially all the points that were started with, that basically the idea that it's impossible to reach 100% consensus, that it allows for the exploit of interest by experts in the system, consensus itself being up for debate, lengthy consensus-based process being an emergent phenomenon, I guess. So I don't think any of these things I think these things are being inappropriately applied as unique to consensus, and I think these are problems that exist essentially in all systems. I would emphasize for the fact that, on the question of polarization in particular, that the losers of a non-consensus-based legal system are essentially encouraged towards extra-legal activity and action, right? That is to say that, like, a consensus-based system, above all, allowing for voices to be heard in the modification process and in the process of raising objection, is going to encourage people to work within the system. So the idea that people within this system are going to just disagree, that may be fine, right? It may be fine to allow people to disagree and still allow them to have their way in a certain context, or confined to a certain area, or confined within a certain sort of cultural setting, or all these things. And that's a process that can only really be explored in a consensus-based model, as opposed to a majority democracy model, or God forbid the monarch, the omniscient and beneficial and benevolent monarch, which, for all intents and purposes, is precisely the magic that I'm accused of invoking, but seems to be the go-to system for challenging whether or not consensus is the best way to reduce exploitation. And again, I think we just need to focus on that question of exploitation and what it actually means, right? What we're really talking about, in my opponent's definition of exploitation, which is the advantaging of one group at the expense of another, is really what is the net cost to people in terms of what they consider expensive. This has to do with their subjective desires, not what you think is appropriate in terms of cost. The idea that you say, like, it costs less to prevent people from murdering than costing less to allow people to live, this is kind of irrelevant, and that's kind of the point, is you don't get to make that decision for the subjective individual, right? Their subjective desire in the consensus model gets to be expressed. Now, the fact that people may disagree or be contentious on such an issue does not ruin or destroy the consensus model. It doesn't even necessarily subtract from its expediency, depending on the rules or refinements that are in place. There again is nothing that says you can't institute rules that does not allow to people to modify the proposal in direct negation, right? So you can't just go back and forth between yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, but that you have to modify it in such a way that moves it forward into an alternative proposal, right? That modifies the original two premises, the thesis and the antithesis, if you will, and creates a synthesis of the two. And only through a process of that do we actually formulate the highest level of consent, which is really what we're concerned with when we talk about expenses. Because the question isn't, is there expenses? The question is, are people willing to give up whatever those expenses are for the benefit of the system? And of course, every legal system is founded on the premise that people are willing to give up and expend certain things in order to follow that legal system. You wouldn't follow the law unless you thought that following the law created a better result for you than not following the law. And this is precisely where the question of criminality comes from. So I really don't think that a consensus-based model suffers any particular flaw that is not within any other system. And I think by maximizing the involvement and process in which objections are raised, concerns are logged, everything is transparent. People can raise questions of accountability and say, hey, I predict this is going to happen if we do this. I'm going to allow it to go through. I'm not going to block it. But if this happens, I want my voice raised that this is what I think is going to happen. You can start to see a much better process where people are actually less polarized and they feel that their involvement in that process allows them opportunities to be able to participate in the legislative process as a whole. And this will actually reduce over time, I think, the extra legal action by agents, because even if they disagree, they realize that they can disagree in a manner which allows them a voice and allows them a way to actually make modification. So overall, I think that I think that my opponent has failed to show that it is not the best at reducing exploitation. I think he has well argued that other systems or that consensus will have a degree of exploitation. I don't think he's. I think he's done well to argue that. Yeah, so I think he's done well to argue that, but I don't think that he's argued well that another system would reduce exploitation better. So I'll leave it at that.
All right, and CoolDog, you're going to have 5 minutes and 15 seconds for your closing statement here, and then after that's done, we'll go ahead and invite Stone back up here and get a vote going.
Yeah, so first I'd like to, as always, thank our dear moderator, Walt, for his fantastic job, right? Also my opponent for having a great and interesting debate, and as my favorite is the peanut gallery, because they stuck through this stuff with us. And so I think in my closing statement, the major disagreement that we have here is that I hold that it to be just as absurd as to find a literal Jesus to run our country as it is to think that you can get a sizable group of people to agree on certain issues which are polarized, and that there is no synthesis possible with certain views that people do hold that you need to represent. We used abortion as like that. And so I think we just fundamentally disagree there, and that I think that this will certainly make it to where the inability to get over these categorical differences will open the door for more exploitation. It can't be responsive enough to get any legislation on there. And so the other things that you have to think about is, again, I've provided a ton of arguments about how has a lot of problems with it. You need to ask yourself, of all the possible options, even some of the ones you may not be able to think of, right? Is it the case that this system is the best, right? And I think I've done sufficient evidence to provide some argument for that. But as well as I think that the strongest alternative that I have absolutely vote on that, right, is like these permutations, sort of like a constitutional based system where we have unalienable rights, not be or certain rules that are not up for census in order to ensure the working system, right? Or to make sure that that there are laws that must be passed, not be gotten into deadlock, right? And so I think that that's a very important patient, right? That actually the fundamental right, fundamental mover there is something different than itself, as well as I think that like a parliamentary and representative democracy system with a lot of good procedural modification. I think we see that the current like U.S. is a little bit broken, right? Certainly not the best. But I think if we take a more democratic system, the ability to get laws passed outweigh longer amount of time, the much longer amount of time, as I argue, that it takes some level of right. So I think that's another, as well as some certain function theoretically possible or more than a minimal amount of happen. Again, like a localized must survival small group, smaller group of people also. Oh no! Oh no! Sorry. So I was talking about how there are other types of systems, like specifically a more localized, needed for survival system, which would be theoretically less exploitative, as well as the permutation, where it's like a fundamental rights are the true mover of the system in place, right? That would overcome all the efficiency problems of a purely or uh, a consensus based exclusively system, right? Is when you have these fundamental things, then that does better. And so I think that, like, you as an audience member, sorry, my god, yeah, okay. So like, again, let's go over like the voting issues, right? If you think that the consensus based system can somehow incorporate in the laws contradictory polarized views, then if you if you don't think it can do that, then I think it's clearly not going to be able to pass things and to reduce exploitation, right? I mean, the other voting issue I think that's like really live here is the responsiveness to oppression as well, is because the consensus-based system, if you do believe it's going to take longer to get to it because you can't, because you have no threshold that you can reach where enough people agree, then I think that, like, the emergent problems will overcome and cause more exploitation than a system that isn't entirely consensus based. And so again, if you think any of the counter systems that I've run are good, then you should vote for me. As well as if you think that my offense against the consensus-based system, the negatives of that system, if you think that that makes it impossible for it to be considered the best for reducing exploitation, then you have to vote for me. So I think I said everything I need to say. Again, thank you everybody for a wonderful debate. I enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
All right, and thank you, CoolDog. Thank you, Marximillian, both for agreeing this moderation. I know we had some change ups in rules kind of as we went here, and that's fantastic. With that being said, we'll go ahead and turn over to Stone Shepherd. And before we do, if anyone wants to hang out, a very common thing we do after debates is I'll head over to Sirius Saloon. I have some children I have to attend to afterwards, so I won't be available. But anyone that wants to discuss the debate, feel free to jump into one of the saloons after you vote and to take that time.